So if you hang out with me long enough, you'll know that I like to ask certain questions, to have them at hand. I used to use these with my students at the university frequently in classes. And I'd encourage in those contexts for students to ask 5 questions, which really you could ask of anything from a resume to a relationship. And the 5 questions are, what stands out to you about this, whatever this is? Or what surprises you? Or what puzzles you? Or what connections do you see? And finally, what implications are there? Or so what? So what stands out to you, what surprises you, what puzzles you, what connections do you see, and what implications are there? Or so what? Questions like that would teach my students to think critically, but I would say generally, living life through a set of questions helps you to live in reality. It helps you wake up to what is happening right now, both within you and without. And if you and I have had a chance to talk on a more personal level, maybe in spiritual direction or pastoral care, you may have heard me add another question, especially in times of stress or discernment or opportunities. And this is the other question. So, what's the temptation here? What's the temptation here? It's a question that presumes that living in reality, we live in the reality of 3 great harmful influencers in the spiritual realm. And they may sound archaic or old-fashioned, but that's because they've simply always been true. The 3 great maleficent influencers, theologically, are the world, the flesh, and the devil. And none of them want us to ask questions. Now, the world, what does that mean? Well, that's simply the world's way of doing things without being bothered by questions like, what's actually just here? Or what's actually true here? Or what's actually good to do here? The world's way of doing things is just the way the world does them. We may encounter these ways at work or indeed in relationships, but the world doesn't want us to ask questions. No, we're just going to do things the way we've always done them. The flesh, what does that refer to? Well, it doesn't really refer to flesh and blood, as Paul says, but really for our human desire for unfettered freedom in getting what we want and how we get it. The flesh doesn't want us to ask questions. We want what we want. The devil, to complete the unholy trinity, is the maleficent influencer par excellence, right? But he frequently operates through the world in the flesh and not putting himself front and center, but hides, lest we wake up to what's actually going on. He would prefer we sleepwalk into the world and the flesh. As Uncle Screwtape tells his nephew Wormwood in C.S. Lewis's Screwtape Letters, which is a series of letters from a senior tempter to a junior tempter, telling him how to tempt the patient, Screwtape writes this to his nephew: "Our policy for the moment is to conceal ourselves. I do not think you will have much difficulty keeping the patient in the dark. The fact that devils are predominantly comic figures in the modern imagination is going to help you. If any faint suspicion of your existence begins to arise in the patient's mind, suggest to him a picture of something in red tights and persuade him that he simply can't believe in that. And since he can't believe in that, he can't believe in us generally." That is the strategy of concealing, of choosing not to live in reality. Our Eastern Orthodox brothers and sisters make a lot of a virtue they call in Greek nepsis. And nepsis is just a certain watchfulness in life, a certain vigilance, a kind of grown-up version of looking both ways, but one of the ways now being within us. as we look into our own hearts. So in fact, perhaps the most important spiritual warfare question, if you want to put it that way, is that one. What's the temptation here in any given situation? What's the temptation here? In our gospel passage today, of course, we see Jesus at the very beginning of his ministry, and he's led into the wilderness, we would call it a desert, to be tempted by the devil. And he's led by the Spirit, no less. And while we pray weekly not to be led into temptation, right? It was part of Jesus' preparation for his particular calling to face the temptations of his leadership early, so he wouldn't be surprised when they would rear their head in the coming years. And it was also important that at the beginning of his ministry, he deal with the same enemy that defeated Adam. Jesus has been called the second Adam, who announces, in this case, his messiahship by replaying the scene from Genesis, but this time overcoming the enemy, remaining faithful to the Father's will. But the devil is brilliant. And the brilliance of his temptations are that they legitimately present Jesus with legitimate needs, and even ends that are already ordained for Jesus. He affirms that Jesus, for instance, should receive all the kingdoms of the world. It's not the what that's the temptation in these temptations. It's the how Satan is inviting him to achieve them. As we are accustomed to say, the devil's in the details. So now this passage in the Gospels, the tempting of Jesus in the wilderness, is so rich with connections and implications that are relevant to every age and every one of us, that it is hard to capture it in a single sermon. But it is still important that we look into these and ask, what indeed are these temptations that are kind of universal for all ages and all of us, especially in times of decision or struggle or insecurity, which are basically the human condition. So the first temptation, to create bread out of stone, might be defined as the temptation to deal with difficulties, uncertainties, and stresses of life primarily through the satisfaction of our human hungers. In times of stress or uncertainty, or when we're feeling insecure, simply to plunge into the appetites. That's always a temptation. Just to plunge into the appetites, into pleasures. The second temptation, where he invites Jesus to throw himself off the top of the temple and be caught by God's angels, might be the temptation to secure ourselves in the world through our image, our public image, our status, our connections, the particular kind of social power we might call popularity or fame. And the third temptation, often when the previous subtle one fails, is to secure ourselves through coercive control, through more brute forms of power or intimidation. Pleasure, status, control. These are the temptations presented to Jesus at the beginning of his ministry. And the devil, in his brilliance, is going to kind of integrate these temptations with sound bites from Scripture, giving them the appearance of reasonableness, even a kind of divine logic. So let's take a look at them. The first temptation is that the devil offers Jesus, or invites Jesus to turn stones into bread, provoking him to prove he is the Son of God. Now, of course, this would strike Jesus first at a very physical level. He's been fasting for 40 days when these temptations begin. Surely it's not unreasonable for Jesus using his peculiar powers to cook up some stones for bread. Not something you and I could do, although I frequently, in baking, turned bread into stone. But I haven't been able to do the opposite. Not unreasonable, surely, but in this context, Jesus knows that this is a ruse to begin a habit, to create a precedent of using his unique creative powers for his own gratifications only. To use it, as I said, to plunge into the human appetites as the answer to insecurities and uncertainties and stress. And although we don't have such miraculous powers, I think earlier ages would look at us and marvel how almost magically we can call forth the world's pleasures with a few taps on our phone or on our keyboard. It would be like magic to people from the early world. Now, like bread, some of the pleasures we enjoy are great in moderation or in specific contexts. Food, drink, entertainment, sexuality, laughter, fitness, and the list goes on, are part of the many gifts from God to us. Some of these could even be vocational or intellectual pleasures, like success in business or growth in knowledge, even spiritual wisdom. But it's important to remember that we are all addicts or potential ones. And when we find something that works, at least for the moment, and we usually find them early on in life, we cling to them. We think they're going to save us. Even the good things. In another section of the Screw Tape letters, Screw Tape counsels Wormwood, once the patient has begun to engage a little more in his faith, to say, keep him thinking about God, but never praying to God. I'll have to confess, in my own life, I would sometimes rather read than pray. Reading, of course, is a good thing. But there are times when I need mostly just to go to God. But I go to a book as a means of power or control over the material of my life rather than the vulnerability of prayer. We go around God, even with the good things. God who is meant to be the bread of life. This is the basis for fasting in Lent. Lent is the counter practice to plunging in to certain pleasures in avoidance of God. The question here for us is, Lord, how have I come to cope? What have I come to rely on? What human appetite is my go-to? And how might I be missing out on a life with God? Missing out, as Lewis says, making mud pies when what is on offer is a holiday at sea. So that would be the first question. What is the temptation here? And are some of my temptations a go-to, which with normally good pleasures, but now ones that are used to avoid God and dealing with what is really going on in me before him? That's the first temptation. Second temptation that Satan offers Jesus is to throw himself off the highest point of the temple in Jerusalem and let the angels catch him. It's a kind of Cirque du Soleil performance that shows Jesus to have connections in high places, as opposed to the somewhat private satisfaction of human appetites. This is a very public spectacle that Jesus is tempted to undergo. What's the temptation here? Well, it's perhaps to seek glory and attention in worldly terms. Something that'll please the crowd. Something that'll make a big splash. Something that'll impress others with our connections in high places. Something to show off our spectacular performances, our spectacular achievements. The last temptation, turning stones into bread, has a little bit of this one in it. He says, turn stones into bread to prove you are the Son of God. Do something amazing. We know you want to lead people. You know you want people to follow you. Do something incredible. Show them your connections. What did the Roman poet Juvenal say in Rome? Give the people bread and circus. Give them food and spectacle, and they'll love you. For us, this might be the temptation to be a people pleaser. To just always give people what they want, rather than to stop and go, what is the right thing to do here? What is the good thing to do here, even for the person? Jesus will, of course, feed people. He will indeed do miracles of multiplication of bread. But he will do them not through manipulation or for the sake of manipulation. He will not do it just to please them. He'll do it because he has great compassion on them, and there's a big difference. Still, in another way, this temptation might be for us a way to secure ourselves with other people through our own importance, our own achievements, our own status, our connections, say in conversation. Now, we all want to be known and loved. And of course, this is a good thing, to be known and loved. We were designed that way, you and I were. But often our legitimate need for attention begins to be a kind of competition with other people. A way to achieve that connection in relatively superficial ways, hiding behind or living within an image or status or achievement that is a kind of caricature of us, living in inauthenticity. I think, for instance, social media has wonderful uses. And I think we all know, though, that the world of image and attention is empty. What is now called the culture of self-display is often only screen deep. Sometimes with sad results for our children, or for girls and women especially, I would say. We might ourselves be projected or tempted to project images of success, even in ministry. Now, public relations in business is a fact of life, right? But it's also a temptation for falsification in everyday relationships. As we're always playing to our strengths, we're always leading the conversation to our achievements, always thinking what we're going to say next, hoping to outshine another person. And such a tournament of self-display, of throwing ourselves off the temple and being caught, is not really an act of love for others, but leaves them doubting their own worth and craving their own significance. Again, what is on offer here is something better, real connection with people, which is often instead through our shared needs and weaknesses. What does God say to Paul in 2 Corinthians 12? When he is particularly hindered by weakness, he says, "My grace is sufficient for you. For my power is made perfect in weakness." And then Paul says to us in 2 Corinthians, "Therefore, I'm going to boast all the more gladly about my weaknesses so that Christ's power may rest on me." Power is not a bad thing. It is how we get it and use it. That is the temptation. So as fasting was the antidote to the coping mechanism of appetite, so a little-known spiritual discipline called the discipline of secrecy is the antidote to the temptation of self-display. Secrecy is where, for a period of time, we kind of test out, maybe not always trotting out our best achievements, not always trying to one-up things, not always talking about what we're doing, even in our spiritual lives. Now, this can be a form of discipling, to lead others with what we're doing, but it could also be a temptation, the temptation of self-display. I have a friend who is a major speaker, theologian. She decided for Lent a few years back to not accept any speaking invitations during Lent as a kind of practice of secrecy. She said it was so hard. She said, "I felt like I disappeared from the world. I felt like I was no longer visible to anyone." So much had she come to rely on display, which wasn't a bad thing. She would go on after Lent and preach and teach and speak, but she wanted to test it out and say, where have I put my eggs, in what basket? That would have been a practice of secrecy. So fasting as an antidote to the addictions of pleasure, secrecy as an antidote to the culture and temptation of self-display. And third, finally, the devil tempts Jesus to gain all the kingdoms of the world at a moment, simply by bowing down to the devil. We know this would be going the way of force and coercion rather than humble love and its necessary sufferings, which of course would empty out the good news of the kingdom of God completely. Satan's logic is, hey, look, you're going to get all the kingdoms of the world anyway. Right? So why not let's just cut to the chase right here? You're not going to have to deal with all the skirmishes of the religious authorities. You're not going to have to deal with the frustrating education of the disciples. You're not going to have to deal with the pressing needs of the masses. You're not going to have to deal with the cross. Let's just cut to the chase. You're going to get there anyway. The offer is for achieving power without humble love and its necessary sufferings. It is falling temptation to asking only what the what is and not the how. Again, a certain amount of control in our lives is a good thing. We should have control over schedules, finances, health. We should often minimize suffering where we can. But sometimes there are things we can't control, right? And then we try to strong-arm them. And we may get what we want, but we've done some damage along the way. We may have discovered we can get what we want or get people to do what we want with a little blaming, a little shaming, some anger, a little criticism, a little martyr's guilt, or outright bullying. The flesh is genius at finding ways to control. One of the ways I control is through words. I say what I want, I say what I mean, I try to persuade, and then if it doesn't work, I say it again. Or I put it another way. Or I verbally try and fix everything, silencing others along the way. Sometimes I just need to shut up and trust God. And that's what's on offer here, is trusting God. It is the peace of trust which can't be built in a day. Trust moves at the speed of relationship. And every time that we have to give up control or have determined that the way we're trying to achieve it is not good, we get to practice the intimacy and vulnerability of trusting God. So again, in these moments where we just can't fix things, we just can't control things, we stop and we ask, what's the temptation here? What's the temptation here? How have I learned to cope, taking what are otherwise good human pleasures, or good achievements, or good strategies, and turning them into gods that save me? What's the temptation here? A message like this has the unintended consequence of focusing on the negative, or in turning Christian life into a game of whack-a-mole with sin. That's not what it's about. All we need to really do is turn to the Lord and one another in certain situations, over a meal, on a drive, in discussion, and ask, so, what's the temptation there? As we help one another follow Jesus instead, which is what Lent is about. So as the musicians come back up, just in this pause, ask yourself, right now, what are the temptations here? What is difficult right now? What is hard? What do you need? There are ways to move forward with Jesus, but ask yourself, but with me, what's the temptation here?